Hey folks, I want to do a bit of a thought experiment with you for a moment. Imagine a cheeseburger. Sorry, that's not the thought experiment, I just wanted you to imagine a cheeseburger. Let's assume you are a supporter of the American Revolution. You believe the United States of America, for all its flaws, is better off separate from the control of the British Empire. How would your position change if you found out that the many protests against British rule didn't happen entirely spontaneously, but actually required a fair bit of planning beforehand? How would it change if you found out that some of the people who were mistreated by the crown also held political views that disagreed with the crown? Would either of these things change your opinion of the revolution, perhaps cause you to oppose it? If these sound like odd questions to ask, you already understand something that followers of Blaze contributor and racist propagandist John Doyle do not. Let's try a few more questions before we move forward. Would you suddenly oppose the American Revolution if you found out that an ancestor of George Washington actually supported the monarchy and even helped it cement control over the colonies? What if you learned that the ancestors of every American revolutionary did bad things sometimes? Would you be stupid enough to switch sides upon learning these bombshells? Have I convinced you to become a monarchist? This is, in a nutshell, almost exactly what John Doyle is attempting to do in his thus far incomplete series, Exposing Black History, which he intends to produce in 28 short parts over the course of this month. We'll be covering the first three, actually four, parts of this series in a moment here, which is all that's out at the time of writing. But we should probably first address the purpose of a series like this, or rather, ask ourselves why a person might choose Black History Month as an opportunity to spend 4 straight weeks trashing black people. If you guessed because he's racist, you're partially correct, but your answer isn't quite complete. The purpose of this series, at least to my eyes, is to silence primarily black people who dare to criticize racial apartheid. Every idiot racist who watches this series will be gifted dozens of thought-terminating cliches to spew at anyone who thinks state violence against minorities is a bad thing that we should stop doing. The racist strategy here is essentially to make their allies so cruel and stupid that their enemies are demoralized and demotivated from voicing the truth. So let's do just that. Just to put my cards on the table, I am of the opinion that the civil rights movement was quite good. If I had any complaints, it'd be that it didn't go nearly far enough. Pause for applause. Really quick, I do feel that I should throw in a little bit of a content warning here. We will be talking a lot about racism, obviously, and the institution of slavery, which touches on various forms of violence and sexual abuse. Be advised. Doyle's first video claims to debunk the Rosa Parks story, so let's hear what he has to say.
Day one of exposing black history because it literally didn't even happen.
We'll keep this in mind moving forward. According to Doyle, the Rosa Parks story literally didn't even happen.
Day one of exposing black history because it literally didn't even happen. So we all know the story, right? 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, she's this tired seamstress. She refuses to give up her seat to this white guy after a long day's work because her feet hurt. She gets arrested for this, and then it sparks a bus boycott. She becomes the mother of the civil rights movement. She's now remembered as a brave hero who stood up to power.
I mean, that's the poorly summarized preschool version, but the most important facts there are right. Rosa Parks was, in fact, told to move so that a white man could take her seat. She refused, and the fallout from this refusal sparked a renewed interest in civil rights. Some schools do teach the story this way, and they absolutely shouldn't. Anyone who's taken 15 seconds to Google the story will likely know that Rosa Parks was already a civil rights activist and actively put herself in harm's way to force Americans to confront the cruelty of segregation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. She chose to be the next victim of state-sanctioned violence in the hopes of preventing it from happening to other people. But apparently, none of this happened, so it's all a moot point, right?
The entire thing was a planned publicity stunt from the beginning. By 1955, Rosa Parks was already an experienced left-wing activist. She and her husband were attending Communist Party meetings. Also, her husband owned a car.
We'll allow this flaccid debunk to continue in a moment, but I do have to jump in to laugh at that "her husband owned a car" comment. What the fuck does that have to do with anything? Seriously, I would love for one of you morons to try and explain to me why that would be relevant in any way, shape, or form. Does the existence of a car in any way make segregation a morally defensible policy? To be clear, I know why you think that's important. I'd just like to hear you try and put it into words. Really take the time to figure out why choosing to take the bus whilst being married to a car owner justifies being publicly humiliated, racially harassed, and forcibly detained. Think on that and get back to me.
So this is not even the first time this happened. Black people were getting arrested for this stuff, but the NAACP and the activists ignored them, and Rosa Parks was specifically selected as the perfect subject for this agenda. She was polite, she was employed, she was married, she was seen as somebody who would be sympathetic to white people.
No, the NAACP didn't ignore everyone else who'd been harmed by segregation. They chose the most viable strategy for fighting it. Black people knew then, as they tend to know now, that white people, by and large, are racially biased, or racist if you want a single word for it, whether they want to admit it to themselves or not. This is just a fact of reality that any real political strategy has to contend with, especially if your goal is to build a society where that is not just a fact of reality. So, the NAACP strategized, saw that black people across the country were being abused, imprisoned, attacked, and overall suppressed, and came up with a plan, a way of forcing people to confront how wrong they and their society were for allowing these injustices, and, more importantly, a way of forcing them to stop. And because a lot of y'all are racist, they needed a person who was as impervious as possible to racist attacks. They couldn't feasibly use the story of Claudette Colvin, a previous major victim of bus segregation, for a variety of reasons, one of which being that she was an unwed mother. To the rational mind, this of course would be irrelevant, but the segregationist pundits and politicians at the time would have used this fact to distract from the issue at hand. And while to the best of my knowledge, this isn't simply an accepted historical fact, Colvin and others have also noted that Rosa Parks was likely in part chosen not only for her spotless record, but also her lighter skin. To a racist white audience, this made her inherently more sympathetic. If this in any way diminishes the importance of the Montgomery bus boycott or civil rights movement to you, I'm afraid you may just be looking for excuses to defend racism. Fighting bigotry requires understanding it and strategizing against it.
And actually, the Rosa Parks incident itself was actually a reproduction of a prior incident where they planned to make a different woman into this kind of figurehead, but then they found out that she got pregnant out of wedlock, and so they had to sub her out for old Rosa.
We've already mentioned Colvin's contributions, but I did want to point out that this is, at best, a half-truth, and at worst, an outright lie. Claudette Colvin's refusal to bend the knee to segregation and subsequent arrest at the age of 15 was not, in fact, planned. She just did that. Kind of a legend move. While it's true that the NAACP considered organizing around this event after the fact, they chose not to because of the aforementioned pregnancy, as well as Colvin's age, poverty, and probably appearance. Plus, Rosa Parks was a more established name in the civil rights scene and could likely garner more attention, which, when your end goal is nationwide liberation, is kind of important.
What's funny too is that she actually had to ride around on a few different buses before this happened, since the rules weren't really meant for women, they weren't really enforced on female passengers.
Yes, they were. Exhibit A, it happened to Rosa Parks. Exhibit B, it happened to Claudette Colvin. What, are you shocked that it took a couple of iterations for the specific occupancy conditions required to put this policy on display to manifest? He goes on to mention her pre-existing experience with the bus driver who called the cops on her, James Blake, as he'd racially harassed her before, but here's the next relevant bit before we move on.
Here's the kicker though, Montgomery law segregated buses, but it didn't actually require black people to give up seats to white people if no other seats were available. Rosa Parks was sitting in the middle section, and she wasn't asked to move until more passengers started boarding. Basically, you had a white section, a middle section, and a black section, and the driver was trying to move the sign to expand the white section of the bus into some of the middle seats, since there were a bunch of white people about to get on the bus, and so we asked Rosa Parks and a few black guys if they would move from the middle section into the black section, since it would literally be illegal for him to tell the white passengers to go sit in the black section. So the guys were like, all right, yeah, whatever. But she went along with her plan, and so she was arrested because she wasn't listening to the bus driver.
And how was that the kicker? Segregation was the policy of the time. Parks was protesting segregation. I have no clue what he's trying to prove here. This is just exactly consistent with the story most people know, just slightly more granular. Although I'm sure someone more intimately familiar with history could probably poke a few holes with what he said regardless. Maybe he thought it was a good idea to defend James Blake via Nuremberg defense? I don't know. Notably, even Doyle cannot deny that the inciting incident here, i.e. segregationist policies forcing a black woman to submit or be imprisoned, is exactly as it's described. You know, the important part. He goes on to complain about Parks's future work, but I think we've seen enough of this video. As a reminder, this is how we started.
Day one of exposing black history because it like literally didn't even happen.
Apparently by that he meant it literally did happen, but my followers are so intellectually incurious that they never Googled the specifics. I, for one, think it's actually kind of rad that Parks and the NAACP understood the evils of segregation well enough that they could reliably predict exactly what it would do and how the public would respond. Let's look at the next video, which I promise will definitely be quicker.
Day two of exposing black history because like it literally didn't even happen.
I mean, you did a shit job the first time, but all right.
I've heard for my whole life that we can't understand American history without essentially orienting the entire conversation toward the practice of slavery. Thus, we must take time to discuss the first legally recognized slave owner in the American colonies, a black man named Anthony Johnson. Now, I don't know why we don't learn about this guy in school. I mean, he got to Virginia in 1621. Historian Philip Foner called him the patriarch of black property owners in America.
Okay, a couple of notes here. One, first legally recognized slave owner is doing a fuck ton of heavy lifting here. As Howard Zinn argued in his book that you guys all want banned for some reason, while enslaved black people were described as servants prior to Johnson's legal victory, they were, in fact, simply enslaved with limited exceptions, one of whom was Johnson himself, who gained his freedom in the manner indentured servants were supposed to. Two, because of what I just said, Anthony Johnson is not nearly as notable as you want him to be. Don't get me wrong, like he's worth discussing in history class, but slavery was happening before and after his court case. The biggest change here, so far as I can tell, was the change in branding.
So essentially, Anthony Johnson was kidnapped by African slave traders in southern Africa, sold to the Portuguese, sent to Virginia where he eventually earned his freedom, but then he would go on to purchase slaves himself and even use the legal system that we're told is so systemically anti-black to take a black slave away from a white guy, and then he would end up becoming, an extraordinarily wealthy tobacco farmer.
So I don't want to shock you or anything, but generally, when people say the legal system is systemically anti-black, they mean the legal system right now, because it is. They usually aren't talking about the legal system of what is effectively an entirely different country in the year 1651. I'm sorry to hear that you've been confused about that this entire time, but hopefully now you'll reevaluate all the stupid shit you've said over the years. Second, the legal system back then was also anti-black, dumbass. There was a black man on both sides of this case. One man wanted not even his freedom, just the opportunity to enter into a marginally less abusive labor contract, and the other wanted to own the first man as property. Unsurprisingly, the white people in charge, who agreed that Casor's contract was completed, still ruled that he, a black man, could be owned as property. And then, the rest of history happened, and it turned out that this racist decision had racist repercussions. Zinn notes in chapter 2 of A People's History that white servants were punished for defiling themselves by sleeping with a black person, and were, on the whole, punished much less harshly than the black servants, because no shit. He also notes, and I apologize because I'm about to do more reading than I plan to in this video, that racial discord was intentionally fomented by the white upper class to dissuade slave-servant solidarity. In spite of such preconceptions about blackness, in spite of special subordination of blacks in the Americas in the 17th century, there is evidence that where whites and blacks found themselves with common problems, common work, common enemy in their master, they behaved toward one another as equals. Black and white worked together, fraternized together. The very fact that laws had to be passed after a while to forbid such relations indicates the strength of that tendency. From time to time, whites were involved in the slave resistance. As early as 1663, indentured white servants and black slaves in Gloucester County, Virginia, formed a conspiracy to rebel and gain their freedom. The plot was betrayed and ended with executions. Only one fear was greater than the fear of black rebellion in the new American colonies. That was the fear that discontented whites would join black slaves to overthrow the existing order. In the early years of slavery, especially before racism as a way of thinking was firmly ingrained, while white indentured servants were often treated as badly as black slaves, there was a possibility of cooperation. There are hints that the two despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament. It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together. And so measures were taken. About the same time that slave codes involving discipline and punishment were passed by the Virginia Assembly, Virginia's ruling class, having proclaimed that all white men were superior to black, went on to offer their social, but white, inferiors a number of benefits previously denied to them. All this to say, the transatlantic slave trade was racist, Surprise. However bad you think it was a billion times worse, and like today, where the wealthy sow and encourage racial discord in service of capital, almost the entire structure of American racism was designed with the purpose of keeping the people who do the actual work in their place. No, the fact that a black guy also participated in slavery does not suddenly mean that it was a racially harmonious system or that America is suddenly not built on white supremacy. Only an idiot would think that. Doyle goes on to tell essentially the same Johnson/Casor story that I just told you, though with considerably more racial animus. But before we move on, I'd like to show you one more clip.
A little bit of a sidebar on indentured servants. I don't know if you know this, but because indentured servitude was a temporary labor contract rather than lifetime ownership, like with slavery, they were often treated far worse than slaves were. They were worked harder, they were beaten worse, they were starved more because their masters had no long-term interest in their health, which is why the mortality rate of indentured servants was actually much higher than slaves. By the way, indentured servants in America, overwhelmingly white, just if we're keeping score.
So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the differing conditions for indentured servants and enslaved people. Both were terrible systems, as we know. One lasted much longer and carried greater long-term effects, and it's still defended by creeps like Doyle to this day, while one is not. I'd like to call attention, however, to a couple of things. One, the majority of indentured servants were white because black people were enslaved, not because they were safe or free or well off. Two, as I've established, this dichotomy was, in part, specifically maintained to keep both groups suppressed. So Doyle is ironically falling for the exact same propaganda that slave barons were pushing at the time period by trying to make indentured servitude out to be worse than slavery. Three, the exact conditions Doyle is describing, where those with indentured servants were not incentivized to keep their servants alive because the contracts were temporary, is precisely what the US did to black people post-Civil War, falsely imprisoning them en masse and contracting them out to people who worked them to death. So even in this shitty, warped discussion of history, one of these crimes happened around 400 years ago, and one happened less than 150 years ago, if you wanted to keep score for some reason. Before we move forward, I'd like to read you the opening passage from John Newton's Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade, both because I think it's worth hearing and because it sets up a point that I'm going to make later. If you aren't aware, John Newton was an 18th century slave trader turned abolitionist and also the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. The nature and effects of that unhappy and disgraceful branch of commerce which has long been maintained on the coast of Africa with the sole and professed design of purchasing our fellow creatures in order to supply our West India islands and the American colonies when they were ours with slaves is now generally understood. So much light has been thrown upon the subject by many able pens, and so many respectable persons have already engaged to use their utmost influence for the suppression of a traffic which contradicts the feelings of humanity, that it is hoped this stain of our national character will soon be wiped out. This was published in 1788. It's worth remembering on occasion that even back then, people knew enslaving other people was evil. It was not simply a different time. They had the tools to do the right thing and chose not to, in large part due to the influence of people with a direct economic or personal stake in the institution of slavery. Okay. Video 3, and then we're probably done.
Day 3 of exposing black history because it literally didn't even happen. We've all heard about the slave trade in school, right? You had these Europeans running around the jungle, snatching up Africans, taking them across the ocean away from their black brothers and sisters who they were living with together in perfect harmony. Yeah, I had to watch Roots too.
Okay, admittedly, I don't know what school this guy went to, but I took US history from one teacher who was an extreme conservative, would go on long diatribes about how the Constitution is against gay marriage, and one from a teacher who was more centrist, maybe left-leaning. And neither of them presented this idea that the African continent was or is perfectly harmonious, which is good. Noble savage bullshit should be the thing of the past. But either way, I'm going to say, odds are that if that was your takeaway from history class, you probably weren't paying much attention. Also, I'll readily admit that I hadn't seen Roots prior to this video, but I went back to watch the relevant scenes, and even in that show, slavery was depicted as a collaboration between white people and African slave traders. Kunta Kinte is literally captured by black men, so even in his own example of left-wing propaganda, it doesn't say what he wants it to say.
Problem is, it literally never happened.
Yes, the fuck it did, buddy. He's about to discuss how there was a large number of slave markets in West Africa set up by West African people, primarily selling prisoners of war or people people convicted of crimes to European powers. And this is a bad thing to do. It's not the same as what was often done to these people once they were taken aboard ships and sent off to the New World, and we'll talk about that shortly, but it's still really fucking horrific. These days, we'd call that a war crime. You know what else happened? Europeans carried out coastal slave raids and kidnapped people into slavery. Here's a University of Houston resource, which criticizes Roots directly, by the way, discussing exactly this. Linked below, of course.
Problem is, it literally never happened.
Is an explicit lie, because even misrepresenting these events isn't enough for John. He's literally allergic to telling the truth. And even if he were telling the truth, this should have precisely zero impact on your position on racial apartheid or human slavery, nor America's role in upholding and prolonging it. The only thing it should/would tell you is that the issue is bigger than one nation and should be fought on all fronts. But genuinely, who didn't know that?
But even when you look at the map of where these slaves were going, you've got all of this movement going to South America, you've got some movement in the Caribbean, then you got a little bit of movement, a little bit making its way up there to America. Apparently that's the one we're all supposed to talk about.
Because that's where we fucking live, dumbass. I spend more time concerned about bigotry in America because that's the bigotry I am best equipped to fight. If you want to spend all your time worrying about racism in Brazil, either put together a project to help Brazilians or move to Brazil. Of course, the transatlantic slave trade is not the end of the story for the US anyway, given America banned importing people in 1808, but continued open slavery for another 6 decades, not counting all of the shit we did after that. Not to be crass, but ships were not the only way the American slave population increased, and after 1808, they went hard on the latter option.
Literally only 2 to 5% of these slaves ended up in America, but we're the only country that has to apologize for our history.
Nobody said that. You made that up. You did this because the anti-racist argument is so transparently correct that the only way to argue against it is to make up arguments nobody has ever claimed before. Again, the US prolonged the practice far more than many similar nations, but even so, every one of those countries also has a history of racism and abuse that they need to address. It just so happens that John and I live in the US, so that's the one we should be most able to affect.
We're the only country that has to apologize for our history when we were just doing what everybody else was doing, except way less. And yeah, it's our fault that Africans were establishing these markets to sell each other off in the first place.
I can't believe that I have to say this, but nobody forced you, and yes, I'm including John in this since it's clear he desperately wants to align himself with literal slave traders, to hold people in bondage as personal property. We'd be having a very different conversation if there were all of these slave markets in West Africa, and Europe said, on principle, no, we will not participate in this practice and will instead fight for freedom. But they didn't do that, and that choice had consequences. I can't believe John thinks it's convincing to say that slavery was just too tempting for these poor, innocent Europeans. The other intensely dishonest thing John does here is pretend that the modern ideas of black and white people extend to people in West Africa at the time. Africa is and always has been an incredibly diverse continent with hundreds of thousands of different groups of people. So when this guy says black people were enslaving each other, he actually means multiple entirely different groups of people who didn't view the world through modern American racial politics. Funnily enough, as this textbook, The African Slave Trade from the 15th to 19th century, puts it, many instances of human slavery in Africa were quite comparable to European serfdom, which is to say, we could just as easily make this whole stupid-ass video about how white people couldn't stop enslaving each other, except, of course, that would be stupid. I mean, you could make this same dumbass argument about hundreds of wars between European powers throughout history. Wow, look at how all of these savage white people can't stop killing each other. Guess we should take every opportunity to dehumanize them and deprive them of their human rights. He continues on about the trans-Saharan slave trade and gives some more fucking insane interpretations of history, but we've heard lie after lie from this guy all video. You get the point. Unsurprisingly, Black history did happen. The effects of slavery, apartheid, and genocide are still felt today, despite the protestation of scum like John, but I would like to read you one final excerpt from John Newton's writings that portrays a similar sentiment to the textbook we just looked at. The state of slavery among these wild, barbarous people, as we esteem them, is much milder than in our colonies. For as, on the one hand, they have no land in high cultivation like our West India plantations, and therefore no call for that excessive, unintermitted labor which exhausts our slaves, For, on the other hand, no man is permitted to draw blood, even from a slave. If he does, he is liable to a strict inquisition, for the Puro laws will not allow a private individual to shed blood. A man may fell his slave, if he pleases, but he may not wantonly abuse him. None of this makes any form of slavery or dictatorship acceptable, but it's important to keep in mind. This is a European who has seen quite literally every side of slavery, looking at the oppressive systems present across the world and realizing that what he's participated in, where he comes from, is even worse than a system which allows a man to kill a person he has enslaved. Okay, and I actually inserted this next segment into the script because since writing the rest, John has released his 4th video, and it's honestly bad enough that it deserves to be discussed. The purpose of this video is to defend Thomas Jefferson against the accusation that he fathered the children of Sally Hemings, a girl he had enslaved, and for some reason, to tarnish Hemings' reputation, because nothing says,
"I love black people,"
like mocking a sexually abused enslaved child. Not to spoil too much, but the conclusion of John's video is that Thomas Jefferson was probably not the father of any of Hemings' children, and that his brother Randolph Jefferson was a more likely candidate, though you wouldn't know that from this intro.
Day 3 of exposing black history because it literally didn't even happen. But you probably heard about Thomas Jefferson allegedly having sex with one of his black slaves, Sally Hemings. Apparently they had a bunch of kids together. You learn all about this in school. If you go to Monticello, Jefferson's estate, it's all you hear about. And this is of course done because they would like to further tar the image of the men who founded our country. The good news is that it's literally not even true.
First, I'd like to address the obvious here. Nobody alleges that Jefferson had sex with an enslaved child. This is not possible. The allegation is that he raped her, which he very likely did.
Sally Hemings was not even black like they portray her now to be. She was 3/4 white, 1/4 black. Brittany Venti would be more black than she was. She had fair skin, straight hair, the whole 9 yards. They need you to believe that she was fully 100% black because that's what suits their narrative.
Yes, she was. Race, of course, is not biologically real in any way, so all we have to go off of was how she was viewed and treated, and she was, in fact, a victim of race-based slavery. I'm not arguing this point any further. The attempt to strip this woman's legacy to defend a man who, fully aware of the immorality of his actions, chose to enslave her is fucking repulsive. Not only this, 2 seconds on the Monticello website will show you that they readily discuss the fact that observers described Hemings as having light skin. He's just lying to you. But more to the point, so what? One common thread in these videos of John's is inventing fake positions to debunk. The left desperately wants to hide from you that Sally Hemings had some white grandparents. The left desperately wants you to think that 100% of slavery happened through coastal raids. The left desperately wants you to think that Rosa Parks wasn't a civil rights activist. It's all bullshit, an attempt to distract from the important issues. Even if John were right, he'd still be wrong because none of what he's bitching about even matters to the overall point, and he knows it. He had to make up these arguments after all. The next segment of this video is an attempt to distance Jefferson from Hemings, basically convince the viewer that he probably didn't even like her that much. They didn't travel together often, he didn't write that much about her, that sort of thing. It doesn't really have anything to do with debunking his alleged crimes, so I'm not going to address it. He then says this.
And even though she was 14 when his daughter Marie was 9, when the two stayed with the Adams in France, they said that Sally was even more childish than the 9-year-old daughter Marie.
It's hard to put into words the visceral feeling of disgust I get when I hear this, so I'll put it this way. There is no action enslaved 14-year-old Sally Hemings could have taken that would make me, or indeed any moral person, even consider defending 1 second of what was done to her. She could have caved Jefferson's head in with a mallet, and I would say, you go girl. Next, John tries to argue that Sally Hemings wasn't even Jefferson's type, because Jefferson was publicly attracted to wealthy aristocratic women.
And if you know anything about Jefferson, it does not exactly match up with his taste in women. When Jefferson was in Paris and he's building up the roster, he had a couple women that he was going after, writing letters to. One was a relative of Alexander Hamilton, and the other was Maria Cosway, to whom he wrote his famous love letter, The Dialogue Between My Head and My Heart, wherein he describes with intricate detail the duel between his head and his heart over how smitten he's become with her. The point being, Thomas Jefferson was a highly intelligent, aristocratic guy who was going after highly intelligent, mature, aristocratic English women, not exactly 14-year-old immature slave girls.
To this, I say first, this is quite literally rape apologia. Predators generally don't engage in predatory behavior directly in the public eye, and sexual abuse is not the product of healthy, normal attraction. It is a product of a violent power imbalance. Any attempt to conflate the two is a defense of the abuser. Second, according to Doyle's own logic, Jeffrey Epstein must be innocent because of his relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell. There's no way he did all of that heinous stuff because he had a thing with an adult woman. Obviously, he doesn't believe this, he's just stupid and evil and doesn't care.
Where does this even come from in the first place? Well, there was a paternity test that showed that Eston Hemings, only Eston Hemings, not her other son Thomas Woodson, was a match with Jefferson's Y chromosomes. Okay, so that's literally it. Conclusive proof, Jefferson, you are the father. No, because that DNA also matched Randolph Jefferson, Thomas's younger brother, and his 5 sons. A little bit about this Randolph character. He was described by the Monticello slave Isaac Jefferson as Old Master's brother, Mas Randolph, a mighty simple man, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle, and dance half the night. He was also known for going to bed with them after he was done playing. And wouldn't you know it, guess who was invited to come hang out at Monticello 9 months before Eston Hemings was born? Randolph Jefferson and his kids. So who do you think is more likely to be the father? The sensitive young man who writes sappy love letters to English aristocrats and had to stay home for 2 days because he had a terrible headache after he embarrassed himself in front of a girl he liked? Or his brother who liked to get down, party with slaves, and was also known to have a little bit of an appetite for black queens?
So that's John's conclusive proof. That may not have sounded like conclusive proof, but that's all he had. First, note how he said Randolph Jefferson was invited to Monticello 9 months before the birth of Eston Hemings. This is very careful word choice, as record exists of an invite, but no record exists of his actual arrival during that period. In addition, Thomas Jefferson is the only Jefferson male known to have been in close proximity to Sally Hemings during the conception of every single one of her children. On top of this, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. First, from Israel Gillette Jefferson, a man who had previously been enslaved at Monticello, followed by a portion of Madison Hemings, one of Sally Hemings' sons' memoir. Israel Gillette is quoted as saying the following of Thomas Jefferson. "I also know that his servant, Sally Hemings, mother to my old friend and former companion at Monticello, Madison Hemings, was employed as his chambermaid, and that Mr. Jefferson was on the most intimate terms with her. That, in fact, she was his concubine." Madison Hemings wrote this: "But during that time, my mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine. She returned with him to Virginia. Soon after their arrival, she gave birth to a child of whom Thomas Jefferson was the father. It lived but a short time. She gave birth to 4 others, and Jefferson was the father of all of them. Their names were Beverly, Harriet, Madison, myself, and Eston, 3 sons and 1 daughter." Now, is it technically possible that both of these men were mistaken? Sure. I can't say with absolute certainty what happened here, but DNA has shown that a Jefferson male was the father of at least one of Hemings' children. Thomas was present for the conception of all of her children. Multiple people alive at the time allege Thomas's sexual abuse of Hemings, and at least one of her children openly states that Thomas is his and several of his siblings' father. I wonder why Doyle left all this out. It kind of makes his whole, well, it doesn't sound like Thomas shtick ring completely hollow, doesn't it? Don't get me wrong, I'm not showing you everything either. There's more to discuss here that a qualified historian could better weigh in on. But Doyle has to hide vast swaths of evidence to make his point. And of course, even if he were correct, his best defense of Thomas Jefferson is he allowed his brother to rape people. As always, even if he were right, he'd still be wrong. I don't know if there's any point in this. I mean, there's a point for me because I learned a bit more history from this, but ultimately, you should know that these people know they're lying. They lie like they breathe. There is no defense for this behavior, no both sides of this coin. There is right and there is wrong. Racism in America, past, present, and future, has always been evil. No amount of whataboutism or "but we really wanted to" can change that fact. Other than that, hope John Doyle enjoys his special place in hell. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.